I will basically follow what Holly started for the 19th century, and I will try to extend it into the short 20th century. And I was try to make it as measurable as possible. Namely, some time ago I was trying to calculate and how the length of European borders was changing in the 20th century, and there were some dramatic changes. So I'm not speaking about the borders of Europe, but of borders in Europe. And there were 3 periods of rapid, dramatic change of the length of borders, which means the number of states available, because that was strongly correlated. Basically, one period started 1918 and lasted to 1921-22, and the other was 1938 to 1949. And then we have another, which is the early post-Cold War period, 1990-1992. And the changes were dramatic. Thinking about this fragmentation, because the longer the borders, the bigger the number of states, you have Europe more fragmented into smaller polities and also smaller markets by definition, almost by default. I realized that the topic of this conference, the enlargement of the European Union, or the expansion of the project of European integration, territorial expansion of a project was initially limited to Western Europe. And actually it was invented to solve a set of very West European problems, namely avoid war between France and Germany, integrate markets, and in particular solve the question of who rules the European industrial core, which happened to be at the German-French border, the core of the coal and steel industries in Western Europe, without necessarily having a war or Adolf Hitler empire running it. So it was invented in Western Europe, but having recalculated these borders, I realized, oh my God, it fits perfectly for the questions that were haunting questions or problems that were haunting Eastern Europe for the past century, maybe, probably. And so there is a question mark at the end, but basically I claim that the European project, this peculiar political institution, which is not a state, so because it's not a state, it's neither a nation state nor an empire, provides a solution to the dilemma that has been haunting Eastern Europe in the 20th century. And I stress Eastern Europe because these 3 periods of dramatic territorial reconfigurations in Europe almost completely applied to Eastern Europe. That means east of the line between Lübeck in the Baltic German port, and Trieste in the Adriatic. You may remember that Winston Churchill, in his famous Iron Curtain speech, he spoke about the line dividing Europe from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. Well, in 1946, of course, he couldn't not know that German Democratic Republic will emerge and the inter-German border will emerge for the next few decades. So I have shifted this line, and almost all of the border changes in the 20th century Europe took place east of the line, except for 2 exceptions. One is the state of Ireland, which emerged after the First World War and is unique in Western Europe. And second are the border shifts between France and Germany in Alsace-Lorraine exactly after the First World War, which was not the case after the Second World War. So the story of the borders tells us, well, that this is not so much a European story, this is an East European story. This aspect of European story is very much regionalized in Eastern Europe. And the answer to the question why is rather simple, and I actually answered it asking Holly the question, which is Eastern Europe up to 1914 had been governed by 3 large empires, the Habsburg Empire, the Romanovs, the Russian Empire, and German Empire, which was emphatically a nation state of Germans, but of course inhabitants of Pomerania or Poznań, where there were regional Polish majorities, had somehow different idea about was it a German nation state or an empire. And certainly the government in Berlin pursued a kind of colonial policies in this the Eastern Rim. So we can treat these 3 empires, 3 states as empires. And basically, my question to Holly was to give my answer, which is yes, after 1914, we have the spread of certain Balkanic patterns north up to the Baltic Sea, and nobody else did it, nobody else started, but the Austrian Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Czernin, who at the time of the German-Austrian-Russian peace conference in Brest-Litovsk, the peace conference which established the first peace of the First World War in early 1918, he expressed happiness to his German colleague that Bolsheviks, now ruling Russia at that time, are so eager to claim the principle of self-determination of peoples. So let's use it against them. And they recognized independent Ukraine at the same peace conference. They signed a peace treaty with Bolshevik Russia, which legitimized the withdrawal of Russia a few hundred miles eastward. Basically, Russia lost most of the territories it acquired since Peter the Great at that time. And in the same place, at the same time, the governments of Central Powers, Germany and Russia, recognized a new Ukrainian state. So they were using the Balkanic tool, which in the past had been so effective against declining Ottoman Empire, against the declining Russian Empire, an empire which simply was exhausted by the First World War and collapsing in the flames of civil war and the Bolshevik Revolution. So since this moment, we have had almost constant, or at least repeated, attempts to do something about it. So the first answer was to Balkanize Eastern Europe, and we see it after 1918, and this is the Brest-Litovsk. Brest-Litovsk formerly lasted less than a year. It was replaced by the Versailles Treaty, but the concept was very much the same. You have 9 new states emerging in Eastern Europe instead of the 3 empires, plus Ireland as the unique state of this kind in Western Europe. So, and of course, the total length of borders multiplies. It multiplies, which has obvious consequences for the markets. You have markets fragmented, so let's say Upper Silesia, you have mines on one side of the Polish-German border, but steelworks on the other side of the border, and so on. You can multiply it in respect to each of this border. This way, you have a number of states which have 2 particular features. They believed to be nation states, which at that time meant they imitate France in a very centralized government, and they follow an idea of an ethnic nation which has roots in the German Romanticism. Basically, you have the idea that nations means ethno-nations, not citizenry, as some people believed in France or Great Britain, but rather an ethnic group sharing some language, probably ancestry as well. And these were nationalizing states, not just nation states, but nationalizing states, states that made efforts to make their subjects member of a given nation, or if they believed to be impossible to assimilate, to marginalize them, if that was the case of the Jews, for example. These states were small, which means they were economically fragile, especially in the protectionist 1930s. They had small markets, so in the protectionist era they were hit hardly. And they were vulnerable politically. So when the window of opportunity, when the 2 regional powers re-emerged as regional powers, and that is Soviet Union after Stalin's great leap forward of the 1930s, when Soviet Union became an industrial power, and Germany under Adolf Hitler with his economic success in the 1930s, the fate of these countries were basically sealed, and it was formally sealed by the Ribbentrop-Molotov Agreement in August 1939, which, by the way, was the culmination of this cooperation was the joint Soviet-German military parade in the town of Brest-Litovsk, now at the border of European Union, and the same place where the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk had been signed 20 years before. So this parade ended temporarily, as we know, temporarily, but at that time many people believed it's forever, the short-lived period of nation-states in Central and Eastern Europe, which proved unviable, not viable, neither economically nor politically, too weak to survive the presence of much bigger states, which can mobilize great resources over a wide territory or much greater economy, as that was the case of Germany. And I would say that 1938 to 1949, we have an empire striking back. I start with 1938 because then you have the gradual expansion of Nazi Germany into Austria, Czechoslovakia, then Poland with Soviet cooperation. And basically between 1938 and the summer of 1941, when Hitler ended the German-Soviet cooperation and attacked the Soviet Union, they liquidated, reduced or occupied 11 nation states. From Finland in the north to Greece in the south. 2 new states were created, Croatia and Slovakia, but they were satellite states of Germany. Otherwise, you have a return of the imperial order. But it wasn't just a return of the imperial order of Habsburgs or Romanovs or Hohenzollerns just under, different flags. No, it was very innovative kinds of empires. One was a highly nationalistic, race-based empire with a vision, with a racial vision. And the other had quite universalistic objectives. But what is interesting, while Nazi Germany was establishing a kind of a colonies, like Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, or the general government in Poland, very, very colonial statehood, so to speak. The Soviets were incorporating them into the Soviet Union. So it was still socialism in one country at that time, but very different, but still imperial projects. And they clashed 1941 to 1945. So 1945, the end of war, doesn't bring a return to the status quo ante. In Eastern Europe, there is no return to sovereign small nation states. There is something new, and this is the Soviet bloc gradually imposed. So Poland before 1989 had three neighbors, the Soviet Union, Socialist Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, but some people were joking that in fact they have just one neighbor, and this is the Soviet Union. And all this, and it was lasting. It lasted 40 years. It was peaceful, I mean peace with violence. Peace sometimes means a lot of violence. So that was a violent peace which lasted up to 1989, and then it collapsed. When we think about European integration in the 1990s and 2000, we must remember that what preceded was a great fragmentation of Europe. Because in the early post-Cold War period, we have as many as 16 states appearing in Europe only. And I mean Europe geographically, excluding Georgia and Armenia and so on, so only in Europe. And only one state disappeared, and that was East Germany. So the total length of European borders increased from 26,000 kilometers to 36,000 kilometers, more than a third. So it was great fragmentation of Central and Eastern Europe, not Western Europe at that time. So in a way, we could say that this fragmentation could have lasted if the idea of enlarging NATO and Europe hadn't been proposed. Because the fragmentation takes place in the early 1990s, and they will have this strange limbo. No one seriously considered enlarging European communities into Eastern Europe at that time, or NATO. It came quite later, and in response to the consequences of this disintegration, namely the Yugoslav war, as Ivan Krastev said yesterday. So it was the Yugoslav war, the dramatic, violent aspect of the fragmentation into the return of Balkanization, which made leaders of NATO first and then of European Union to expand into the West, to export stability rather than import instability from this region. So from this perspective, we had first, after a long, many generation lasting imperial period when the state system is an imperial system in Eastern Europe. We have some 20 years of nation states, then we have empires striking back, two empires, the Soviet and the German, and then only one of them survives the Great War on the Eastern Front, the most devastating war in human history, and most inhuman war in human history. But the Soviet army was bringing to Central Europe in 1944-45, they were bringing at the same time a revolution, a social and political revolution, and an old order. So that was a strange combination because the order was imperial. But it was not just, it wasn't a replica of Romanov's empire, because Stalin did not incorporate any new states into the Soviet Union after the Second World War. Contrary to Lithuania or Estonia, that had become part of the Soviet Union in 1940, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and so on were satellite states. And that was despite the wishes of some communists. Slovak and Bulgarian communists, they were applying to Moscow, we want to join the Soviet Union, and certainly if the population was allowed, the population would 98% voted for joining the Soviet Union, very much like Ukrainians in Western Ukraine and Lithuanians had voted in 1939 to join the Soviet Union. So I'm pretty sure that Soviets would have made it in let's say, 1950, such plebiscite. So from this perspective, what we see, the enlargement of the European Union is a peculiar solution to the dilemma, because it's a non-state solution to the problem of the state system. EU is not a state, but it makes small nation states economically viable. And combined with NATO, up to recently I thought it's rather permanent, but I don't think about it no longer. It provides external security to the states which otherwise are undefensible, especially when they have much stronger neighbors, closer or far. So it was kind of an optimistic interpretation of it, but there is another aspect which is even more optimistic, and this is my key point, is that EU doesn't abolish borders. It's not a state. But it changes the nature of the borders. Borders remain, but they are different. Those of you, like Slavko, who had to arrive to this beautiful city from outside of the Schengen zone, know it painfully. Okay? Those who travel within the Schengen zone haven't noticed. Well, they maybe had to use different currencies. Okay? People speak different languages. But it really makes a difference. What happened with the EU enlargement and some pre-enlargement changes is the nature of the European borders within this European constellation has changed. And I find it more important because I am a social historian. I believe what economists call market integration is in fact a growing number of integrations between human beings, individuals, who can trade, who can talk, who can fall in love, marry, have sex, travel. I can meet my fellow historians, gangsters can meet their fellow gangsters, bankers can meet their fellow gangsters, and this is what sociologists call transnational. Transnational space means a space which is above or beyond the state borders. In fact, it's not transnational, it's cross-border. We have cross-border relations, interactions, which make the fabric of Europe. We don't need a common identity, but we need relations across the border. What states do, and especially in radical moments like war, they reduce interpersonal relations of people belonging to various nations to killing each other. There were all the time relations between nations during the 20th century, but sometimes they consisted of bombing the cities of your enemy. And that was the relation between one soldier and the mother of another soldier, in this case. So this is the changing nature of relations between individuals that inhabit certain territory, which is formally still fragmented into this huge number of small nation states, but really something important happened. However, EU is good for some things, it's not good for others. Someone said this afternoon that there are no EU tanks, there are no European tanks. Well, because to my knowledge, if you have a tank, you must be a state. Okay, you may have a gun and be a hunter or a gangster or a policeman, but when you have a tank, you are a state. EU is not a state. I'm afraid that as soon as EU has tanks, it will be something different than it's at present, and it will no longer solve the dilemma of empire versus the nation state. Hence, maybe the game of Mr. Putin now, he may be winning on both sides of it. Either Europe remains fragmented and cannot respond to the challenge, or it integrates to respond to a military challenge, but though it's no longer what it has been so far. Thank you.